In a world where entertainment is viewed as mindless diversion, only good for momentary distraction, one podcast has taken a stand, thoughtfully engaging the art of our day, dissecting the narrative, and pointing the people back to the greatest storyteller of all. You are about to enter a new world, and you will never view entertainment in the same way again. This is Popcorn Theology.
Welcome, movie lovers and theology nerds, to Popcorn Theology, where we examine films for where they align with the greatest story and our greatest storyteller, discussing what to receive, reject, and redeem for common ground, fruitful conversation, and mindful movie consumption. I'm David.
And I'm Eric, and welcome back to our newest series of our discussion in the lobby. As a reminder, this series is part of an exclusive content for our premium seating Patreon saints. Those who support us greatly, we greatly appreciate your support. This first episode that you're watching is available to the public, so please share it far and wide and consider supporting us on Patreon to hear the rest of the discussion.
Absolutely. And so for this series, we're exploring the intersection of faith, film, and politics. And Eric, I'm not sure if you're aware or not, but there's going to be a bit of an election coming up soon. I don't know if you've heard anything about this.
Yeah, I've been hearing about it for the last 4 years. Yeah.
30 seconds after the last one, this one came up. And so, of course, in discussing faith, film, and politics, to help us do that, we've called in a very special guest, New York Times bestselling author, culture reporter for the Daily Wire, Megan Basham. Welcome to the lobby.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This is great to be here. I'm kind of in my all of my wheelhouses here. This is great.
Perfect. Yes, we're thrilled to have you. And this was, very, very intentional that we were able to make this happen. Very glad that we were able to. There's so many different directions this conversation could take. But before we get to, I guess, the meat and potatoes, if you will, we like to briefly talk popcorn as time permits. One reason we were very excited to talk with you is because of your previous roles as a film and TV editor for World Magazine and Radio. So we knew that not only were you involved on the culture side, but specifically in the entertainment world. And so I guess we have sort of a simple but tricky question for someone in your shoes. Do you have a favorite movie?
Ooh, like favorite movie of all time.
Yeah, I know. It's a mean question. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, you always feel like when you say that, you want to say kind of the typical Casablanca or My Fair Lady. Those are probably my favorite.
It's not Fast and the Furious or something.
Yeah, not Fast and the Furious, but I like a lot of action movies. I'm like, it's as far as like modern, I really loved the Coen Brothers' True Grit. I like some of the classic Westerns. So yeah, what's funny is I feel like I can like any genre as long as it's well done. So, there's no genre where I cannot appreciate the best films in that, particular area.
That's awesome. That's a good answer.
And, yeah. And of course, another reason why we're talking with Megan is her new book, Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. I thought it was a fantastic book. I read it a little bit of background on myself. From 2012 to about 2014, I read the Huffington Post pretty much every single day just because I was bored at work. And so there's nothing else to do. I was like, I'll see what the opposition's up to. And so it was just kind of an interesting thing when around 2015, 2016, I started seeing a lot of evangelicals just start using this verbiage that I'd been reading from the Huffington Post 2 years prior. So it's just reading your book. I was like, there was stuff going on in the background that I was not aware of, why they started adopting some of these leftist, more progressive talking points. So to kind of start with one of the first questions about your book, I think I got this question from Al Mohler in his podcast, is why this book and why now?
Well, I think you covered why this book pretty well, is that a lot of us started to notice these more progressive talking points coming into evangelicalism. And as somebody who my whole life sort of revolves around my Christian faith, and all of our lives do if you're a Christian to some sense, but it was, where I worked for an evangelical magazine. My kids went to a Christian school. We're homeschooling now, but they've always done Christian schooling of some kind, involved in our church. And so, like a lot of people, I started hearing those more progressive ideologies coming into the spaces that I inhabited. One example I've been giving people is around 2020, the church that we were then at, the children's director sent out an email saying, here's how you can talk to your kids about their white privilege. And, that was a record scratch moment for me where I went, hold up, what is happening here? And some of those fault lines that Vodi Basham wrote about in his book, I experienced them a little bit at work and at our Christian school too. So like so many people, it was just something that I was living. And I actually feel like I was a little late to the game. There were certainly a lot of well-known voices who were covering some compromise and some of the funding coming in from secular left foundations and really well-known, powerful billionaires before I got there. But for whatever reason, they just weren't getting the attention. And I think when so many people started to notice it, there was more of a looking around going, why is this happening? And so that's why I wrote the book, because just like everyone else, I was experiencing it in real time.
No, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, like I said, great work. I counted it up, 650 citations or indexers, whatever you want to say, footnotes.
Wow.
So it was very, very well researched, and really appreciated you going to primary sources.
Yeah, had I known how much of a point of contention they would become, I might have done a little bit fewer, but that's okay.
Well, I guess that does go. What has been, I've seen some of it online, but for the most part, I just ignore almost everything online because it's not actually the real world.
Right.
But so what have been some of the pushback you've been receiving from it?
Well,
I would say legitimate pushback, not like, hey, this footnote was wrong here and there, which is like,
right.
650, someone is going to make a mistake.
Or you made a typo here, got through editing or something,
Yeah, a lot of it has been I think that I have the most combed over book of at least the last few years. I cannot remember any book being so minutely analyzed, which is interesting in itself. But I would say probably if you take away these little, okay, she messed up where this guy graduated from, so we have to throw the whole book out. If you take out that sort of thing, what it has really come down to is some back and forth over some of these high profile leaders saying that is not what I meant when I said that. Now, I would say with the distance of a few years, it's maybe easier to claim that. But I also think a lot of onlookers at the time are standing with me going, no, we were there and we heard it in the moment that you said it. And it seemed pretty clear contextually that this is what you meant. And, one of the probably most contentious questions has been, for example, like whether J.D. Greear, who was then Southern Baptist Convention president, when he advocated ideas like pronoun hospitality, in referring to people who believe they're transgender, and kind of walked that back. Well, did he walk it back or not? And I think that this is a healthy thing for us to be doing an autopsy on. Okay, what were the statements that were made? What led to people wanting to sort of position themselves in what I would say a soft posture when it comes to LGBTQ issues? Why they did that, and what should it mean to us now that there is some desire to distance from it? And maybe that's in part a win, is that the Overton window is moving so that people no longer want to be like smack dab in the middle where they're marching with BLM or advocating pronoun hospitality anymore.
Yeah. No, and you mentioned Rosario Butterfield in the book, and where she moved, and I remember very clearly, she moved from essentially a pronoun hospitality type of thing. But then after Obergefell, she was like, well, no, this is now a political identity type of thing, so you no longer can do it. And she later repented of it. So it's like, yeah, a snapshot in time. This person looks like they support it. Well, they mature, they change, and they repent. And so it's great to have those, like you said, autopsies of these types of movements. And
I do think it's important to distinguish between what Rosario Butterfield did, which was so impressive to me, in that she just bluntly said, I repent. I got this wrong. This was a public sin, so it needs public repentance. And she just kind of didn't try to hedge anything, just said, this is what I got wrong, and I wish I hadn't done that, and here's why. versus some of what I have seen in reaction to the book, which is kind of, well, I'm sorry that you misunderstood me, which is different.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, honestly, I started noticing the through line through all of your chapters of essentially how they started getting evangelicals on board with the leftist talking points was the phrase, love your neighbor. Now, this phrase ended up getting completely separated from anything theological, like at all. Not what did Jesus mean when he said the second greatest commandment, not the first. The second greatest commandment is love your neighbor. He was summarizing the last six of the 10 commandments. So it was like getting away from that. And I just started noticing is like they wanted to say anytime that an evangelical would try to put religion into, let's say, the public sphere. Yeah, hey, we want the 10 commandments in schools. They go, oh, take your religion out of out of the public square. But however, love your neighbor presupposes you support my politics. And so it was this great way of them using our language of love your neighbor to sneak in these other things of going, well, yeah, we want to kill babies, but if you really cared about babies, you'd support XYZ, but they never come our way. Do you kind of have a source of like who first started that like love your neighbor type of theology and how it started to get into evangelical circles in this pernicious way?
Well, I don't know for certain that this was the very first, well-known usage of it. But when I started tracking it, the very first example I found was in the early 2000s when the evangelical climate change movement started to adopt it. So it was when the Evangelical Environmental Network, which was a heavily funded organization that was getting money from secular left foundations like the Clinton Foundation, like the Rockefeller Foundation, like the Tides Foundation. So I would call it something of a front group. It was a shell. And they took that churchy language of love your neighbor and said, this is why we need to support things like carbon emission regulation. So that was when I first saw them bring in that love your neighbor. And at that point, it was really like it was on bumper stickers saying, what would Jesus drive? Don't drive SUVs. And things like that to me were circumventing what should have been a public debate. Because if you're a Christian, you could go, well, okay, but it's also sometimes an undue burden on my neighbor to say they have to pay higher gas prices, or if my neighbor has 5 kids, to suggest that they're doing something wrong in driving that gas guzzling SUV or whatever that issue was. It was the first time that I really saw the spiritual manipulation of that command in a way that took it well outside of how I interact and treat with the people who are right there in my community. So, and then you kind of saw it applied to everything, like you just said. I mean, even to the point where at the DNC last week, we watched, I think it was Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear use it in reference to abortion, saying that we should, and I'm using their language, protect reproductive rights in order to love our neighbors, which is an abhorrent way to use that command. I would almost go so far as to call it blasphemy. And that's what we're seeing with that. And I think that, and I write this in the book, that it became this sort of cheap catchphrase to apply to any bit of progressive ideology. And even things that were debatable, like if you looked at what happened with COVID, things like, should I get this vaccine became, well, you have to love your neighbor.
Yeah. Now, it is an interesting thing. This was probably 20 years ago. I had a conversation with my uncle about vaccines in general. And we were just talking about, hey, how is it? And I believe he was saying that Jonathan Edwards, and he wasn't endorsing this view, but he was saying one of Jonathan Edwards, the reasons why he got the prototype of the smallpox vaccine that actually ended up killing him was love your neighbor. This is a way that for me to protect my neighbor through this epidemic type of thing. So it's this interesting thing how there's always been this impetus to go with that, but are we actually doing the hard work, or are we shoving down love your neighbor? Like he wasn't advocating the government to do it, or you're going to lose your job. He's like, no, I'm going to take it upon myself to do it. So it became a very interesting thing, whereas love your neighbor isn't, hey, love your neighbor and do the right thing. It's love your neighbor, support my politics.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I don't know the provenance of Edwards having said it, but I could see saying, love your neighbor. I feel convicted in my conscience that I am required to do this, to take this action with regards to a policy or a vaccination or whatever it is, because I believe this is how I must love my neighbor. It becomes something different when you wield it as a sledgehammer to say, it's how I believe you must love your neighbor.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Have you interacted with, and just curiosity, have you interacted with Aaron Renn's The Negative World type of book that he wrote? It's called Life in the Negative World.
So I haven't read, excuse me, Aaron's book yet. But I read the original article that went viral and that became the book. So I'm very familiar with Aaron. I consider him a friend and his taxonomy. And I think he's really onto something, because I do think that a large part of what we have seen over the last 10, 15 years, and I think you can go back even to the germination of it in the 1990s, of that seeker-sensitive movement. In a way, the seeker-sensitive movement was what set evangelicals up to adopt their positions, to flatter and appeal to what you might call the more urban progressive sensibilities. So I think that's a fair thing to say. And then as we moved into that negative world, what seemed okay in seeking someone in a neutral cultural environment was suddenly quickly moving into unbiblical. Like when we talk about these ideas of saying, the gay Christian, for example, we're going to say these people, it's okay for them to identify with their sin, because suddenly the ground beneath our feet had shifted in how we talk about these issues. And I do think Obergefell is a really good moment to point to that is where suddenly it was no longer live and let live. It was, you are hostile bigots if you don't get on board with us and change your doctrine.
No, excellent. Thanks for that. I was just noticing that there seemed to be an overlap, like his timeline of moving through versus, and also the timeline of, and this is my own conjecture, it seemed to be that maybe the evangelicals were inadvertently helping to move us into the more negative world, just by adopting some of these talking points and making it become a lot more adversarial type of relationship with Christianity to the culture.
We hope you enjoyed this first episode of our In the Lobby series. To watch future episodes, click the link in the description to support us on Patreon and become a patron saint. Subscribe on YouTube for more content, follow and interact on social media to share with others, and remember, you are not a mindless consumer.